Some stories don't start with a scream or a gunshot. They start with silence. And I swear to you, I've never been afraid of silence until the night I walked into the Ashford State Archive. It was 1971, a wet October evening, and the rain had turned the city streets into black mirrors. I was there for work, research, nothing unusual. But the moment I crossed the threshold of that enormous, stone-walled building, I felt something watching me. It wasn't the guards, and it wasn't the cameras. It was the silence itself. The Ashford Archive wasn't just a library. It was a labyrinth. Endless corridors, shelves stacked floor to ceiling with dusty files, the air always a little colder than outside. It felt like a place that had outlived the people who built it. They told me the story on my first night. The archivist, Thomas Gray. A man who had worked there for 20 years and never once missed a shift. One morning, his desk lamp was still on, a half-finished cup of coffee sat beside a pile of records, and his coat still hung on the rack. But Thomas was gone. The strangest part? The archive was locked from the inside. The police searched every wing, every basement tunnel. Dogs were brought in, but the trail led only as far as a set of heavy steel doors in the east wing, and then stopped, as if Thomas had walked through the metal itself. I saw his workspace that night. His notes were still spread out, his handwriting small and hurried. A cigarette had burned down in the ashtray, leaving nothing but grey dust. And on the center of his desk sat a yellowed envelope. In thick black ink, 4 words. Do not open after midnight. I'll admit, I laughed when I saw it. It sounded like the setup for a bad horror story. But the officer standing beside me wasn't laughing. He said the letter had been there the night Thomas disappeared. No one had touched it since. Would you open it? He asked me. I didn't answer. I only stared at the envelope, wondering what Thomas had written and why he'd left it in plain sight. The rain hammered the windows. Somewhere deep in the stacks, I thought I heard a drawer slide shut. But when I turned, there was no one. Later, when I left the building, I noticed something strange. The road outside the archive was slick and heavy with mud from the rain, yet there were fresh boot prints leading away from the side door. They were deep, like someone carrying a heavy load had just passed through. I followed them until they vanished halfway down the street, cut off as if the person had simply lifted into the air. That was when I realized the story of Thomas Gray wasn't just an old workplace mystery. It was still unfolding. And I, fool that I was already inside it. By the next morning, the whole building was crawling with uniforms. Police cars lined the street outside the Ashford Archive, their lights painting red and blue across the wet stone walls. Inside, search teams combed every corridor, every locked storeroom, every stairwell that creaked under its own weight. I wasn't supposed to be there, but somehow I stayed. Maybe curiosity kept me tethered to that place, or maybe it was guilt. I had been one of the last people to see Thomas before he vanished, and I couldn't shake the thought that I'd missed something, some detail that might have saved him. The air inside the archive was different that morning. Colder, heavier. The rain had stopped, but the smell of wet stone lingered. Boots echoed on the marble floor, and radios crackled with clipped instructions. Then came the sound that didn't belong, claws clicking. The police had brought in a bloodhound, a heavy-shouldered dog with ears that dragged the ground. His handler let him sniff one of Thomas's jackets, still hanging by his desk. The dog whined low, then pulled sharply toward the east wing. We followed. The corridors stretched on forever, lined with towering shelves stacked with grey boxes. It felt like walking through a canyon of forgotten names. The dog's claws scratched against the floor, his nose pressed close to the ground. He was certain. At the end of the hall stood the steel doors. I'd seen them the night before, tall and windowless, marked with years of rust. They were locked, padlocked, in fact, and behind them, according to the building plans, was nothing. Just bricked-over storage. The dog pressed his muzzle to the crack at the bottom and barked, loud and insistent. His whole body trembled with urgency, like Thomas was waiting on the other side. But when the officers forced the doors open, the space beyond was empty. A narrow chamber stretched about 20 feet, with walls of bare stone and a floor covered in dust so thick every step left a mark. The dog strained against his lead, whining, pulling us deeper. At the far end of the chamber was a second door, smaller, bolted shut from our side. The sergeant shook his head. No one's been in here for decades. He didn't come this way. But then I saw it, a smear in the dust. Not a footprint, not exactly. More like something had been dragged across the floor, something heavy. The handler crouched beside it, frowning. This is fresh. We followed the smear to the bolted door. The dog pawed furiously at it, barking so hard the sound bounced through the chamber. My chest tightened. I thought for sure that if we opened it, we'd find Thomas. But the bolt was rusted solid, fused to the frame. It took 3 men to force it free. When the door finally groaned open, the smell hit us first. Damp stone, mildew, air that hadn't been touched in years. The flashlight beams cut into darkness. The chamber beyond was empty. No footprints. No drag marks. Just more dust, undisturbed. The dog stopped barking. He whimpered once, then backed away, tail tucked tight between his legs. The sergeant muttered under his breath. Dead end. But I couldn't shake it, the sense that Thomas had been right there, only minutes before. Like we'd been chasing someone who stayed just one step ahead, slipping deeper into a labyrinth that had no end. And when I turned back, I noticed something none of the officers had seen. On the stone wall beside the bolted door, scratched into the surface with something sharp, was a single word. My name. By the 3rd day, the Ashford Archive felt less like a workplace and more like a crime scene frozen in time. Police tape fluttered across corridors, officers scribbled in notepads, and the low hum of radios echoed through the stone halls. The archivist's office had been sealed, but somehow I found myself back there, standing where Thomas Gray had last been seen alive. The room was exactly as it had been, his desk lamp still angled toward a stack of papers, a jacket draped neatly across the chair, and the faint sour smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. Dust had already begun to settle over everything, as though the place itself wanted to cover up the truth. I ran my hand over the notes scattered across the desk. Dates, names, case numbers. Thomas's handwriting was frantic, as if he'd been racing against time. One file in particular lay open, its corners smudged with ash. It contained a list of missing persons stretching back decades, each name carefully underlined. The final entry stopped mid-word, the pen stroke jagged and broken, like he'd been interrupted. Beside the folder sat the ashtray. It still held the grey remains of a cigarette. That much I'd noticed before. But now, leaning closer, I realized something. The ash was warm. Not hot, not burning, but not fully cold either. Impossible. Thomas had vanished 3 days ago. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Someone else had been here. Someone who'd smoked, finished, and left without the officers noticing. Find anything? The voice startled me. Sergeant Mallory leaned in the doorway, his expression sharp. I hesitated, then showed him the cigarette ash. He frowned, tapping his pen against his clipboard. Strange. We haven't let anyone in here except you. And Thomas never smoked. The words lodged in my mind like a splinter. If Thomas hadn't been the one smoking, who had? Mallory left me to my thoughts, but I wasn't alone. The air seemed to hum faintly, as if wires deep in the walls carried whispers instead of electricity. I turned back to the desk. Beneath a pile of loose papers was a small notebook, bound in leather and marked with Thomas's initials. I opened it. Most of the pages were covered in cramped notes, references to file numbers and cross-references to dates. But here and there, Thomas had scribbled words in the margins. Odd words. Door. East wing. Not locked. Don't let them follow. I flipped further. Voices in the stacks. Sounds like pages turning. Not alone. The last page was worse. The handwriting was jagged, almost unreadable, the letters pressed deep into the paper. If you find this, don't stay past midnight. I closed the notebook with trembling hands. The same warning as the envelope. From the hallway came a sound, a drawer sliding shut. My chest tightened. I stepped into the corridor, but it was empty. Just rows of cabinets and the dim glow of security lamps. Then I noticed something odd on the floor. A thin trail of paper scraps, leading away from Thomas's office. I bent down, picking one up. It was part of a report, torn neatly along the edge, the ink fresh as if printed yesterday. The trail led deeper into the archive, toward the east wing. The same place where the dog had stopped barking. The deeper I went into the Ashford Archive, the less it resembled a building and the more it felt like a tomb. Corridors narrowed into stone stairwells. Stairwells opened into long, vaulted rooms where the air grew heavier with every step. Dust clung to my skin, and my own footsteps seemed to echo back at me a fraction of a second too late, as though someone else walked just behind. The trail of paper scraps led me on, each torn fragment catching the beam of my flashlight. Some pieces were blank, others bore fragments of text, dates, names, half-sentences like whispers frozen on the page. Eventually, the path ended at a heavy door set into the floor, almost hidden beneath a layer of grime. Its iron handle was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. I pulled, and the hinges shrieked as the trapdoor lifted, revealing a stairwell that plunged into darkness. For a moment I stood there, staring into the void below. Then I descended. The steps were narrow and slick, carved directly into the stone. My light picked out chalk markings along the wall, arrows, strange symbols, initials. Some were old, faded nearly to nothing. Others looked fresh, as if scratched only days before. At the bottom of the stairs, the air grew damp and metallic, like the inside of a cave. The passage opened into a vast underground chamber. My light swept across it, revealing row after row of wooden shelves, sagging under the weight of boxes that had been left to rot. This was no official wing of the archive. These were the forgotten records, discarded and buried out of sight. The silence was suffocating. I forced myself forward, brushing aside cobwebs, until my beam landed on something that stopped me cold. A desk. Not old like the rest, but newer, metal-framed, with a chair pulled neatly beneath it. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the surface, its contents dried to a dark crust. A stack of papers lay beside it, pinned neatly with a clip. I reached for the top sheet. My hands shook as I read the heading. Missing Persons, 1971. The first name on the list was Thomas Gray. The second was mine. My stomach dropped. The entry beneath my name was complete, as though someone had already written the report of my disappearance. Date of birth, place of residence, even the words last seen entering Ashford State Archive. The rest of the chamber seemed to close in on me. My light shook across the shelves, catching on other files. More names. More years. Dozens of reports already written, each one filed neatly away long before the people themselves could have vanished. The silence broke. Somewhere in the chamber, papers shifted. A box fell with a dull thud. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only dust swirling in the air. Then, faintly, I heard it. The sound of pages turning. Not one page, not two, but hundreds, all at once, as though every box, every file, every forgotten record had come alive and begun to rewrite itself. I turned back toward the stairwell, but the trapdoor above had slammed shut. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the file with my name written neatly across the top. Minutes, maybe hours. The underground chamber felt timeless, suspended outside the world above. My flashlight beam quivered, tracing the papers stacked around me, each box a grave of names and dates, each folder another story sealed away. Then the silence broke. It began softly, like the flutter of wings. A single page rustling somewhere in the darkness. Then another. And another. Until the whole chamber pulsed with sound, a storm of paper shifting, turning, rewriting. The air itself grew alive with it, as though the archives had been holding their breath for decades and were now exhaling all at once. I staggered backward, clutching the report with my name on it. The words seemed to shimmer, the ink bleeding across the page until fresh lines appeared beneath. My chest tightened as I read them. Disappeared October 17, 1971. Last seen in underground wing. Case unresolved. The date, today's date. I dropped the paper. It fluttered to the floor, joining the hundreds of others that now swirled in the air like a blizzard. My flashlight beam cut through the chaos, landing on the metal desk in the center of the room. The coffee cup trembled. Its dark crust began to ripple, as if stirred by an invisible hand. The desk drawer slid open. Something inside shifted, metallic and sharp. Slowly, I edged closer, my instinct screaming to run but my legs carrying me forward anyway. Within the drawer lay an old key, iron and blackened with rust. Tied to it was a slip of paper, handwritten in the same cramped script I'd seen in Thomas Gray's notebook. Not locked. Don't let them follow. I froze. Them? Before I could think, the air shifted again. A wind rose from nowhere, howling through the stacks, scattering papers high into the rafters. The shelves groaned, the wood splintering under invisible weight. One box toppled, spilling folders across the floor. I bent to catch one and felt my blood run cold. It wasn't paper. It was photographs. Dozens of black and white portraits stared up at me, faces pale, eyes glassy. Men and women I didn't recognize, until I reached the last photo. Thomas Gray. He sat at his desk, the same desk that stood only a few feet away from me. His face was blurred, almost erased, but his posture was unmistakable. And in the far corner of the photo, grainy but clear enough, was another figure. Standing. Watching. Not blurred. Not erased. Me. I dropped the photo. My pulse hammered in my ears. The chamber's lights, ancient bulbs hanging from frayed wires, flickered to life all at once, flooding the room in a sickly yellow glow. The shadows deepened, stretching across the walls like ink poured into water. Shapes began to form within them. At first, they were only outlines, torsos, arms, heads bent low over invisible desks. But as I stared, the shadows sharpened, becoming people. Archivists. Clerks. Dozens of them, each locked in place, each turning invisible pages, their mouths moving soundlessly. And every one of them looked exactly like the faces in the photographs. I stumbled back toward the stairwell, but the trapdoor above remained sealed tight. The iron handle rattled uselessly in my grip. I pounded on the wood, shouting, but no one heard. When I turned, the room had gone silent again. The shadows were still. The papers lay flat on the floor. Only the desk remained, the key still waiting in the drawer. And next to it now, a fresh folder. My name on the cover. I lifted it with trembling hands. Inside were blank pages. Waiting. When I woke, I was lying on the stone floor of the chamber. My flashlight lay beside me, its beam reduced to a weak flicker. The air was still again, as though nothing had happened. No storm of papers. No shadows moving. Only silence. The folder with my name was gone. I pulled myself to my feet, every muscle aching. The desk still stood where it had, the coffee cup still on its surface, but the drawer that had held the key hung open and empty. I looked around, desperate for any sign of what I'd seen, but the chamber mocked me with stillness. Above, the trapdoor stood ajar. A sliver of grey light spilled through the opening. I climbed the narrow steps, hands scraping against the damp stone, and forced myself back into the corridor. The trail of torn papers was gone. The floor was clean, as if no one had walked there in years. When I finally reached the main hall of the archive, the world had changed. It was morning. Sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, painting the marble floors gold. Voices echoed faintly. Official voices, clipped and efficient. As I stumbled toward the exit, I saw uniforms, police, rescue crews, men with radios. Outside, I heard the thunder of rotors. A helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the streets. Someone gripped my arm. We found him. But they weren't looking at me. Two officers carried a stretcher past, a body draped in a white sheet. A rescuer whispered, "Thomas Gray." I froze. My heart lurched into my throat. They spoke as though it was certain Thomas Gray had been found. Yet I knew, with every fiber of my being, that the man under that sheet wasn't Thomas. The helicopter roared above, shaking the windows. The radios buzzed with updates, names, dates. None of it made sense. I tried to ask what had happened, but no one listened. They moved around me like I wasn't even there. Outside, the road leading from the archive had been churned to mud by heavy vehicles. Boot prints crisscrossed the ground, deep and heavy. I followed them a few steps, then stopped. In the mud, alongside the boot prints, was something else. My own footprints. I stared until the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance. The street was empty now. The officers, the rescuers, even the stretcher, gone. The archive loomed silent and grey behind me, its doors sealed shut. I looked down at my hands. They were holding something. A small iron key, rusted and cold. The same key I had seen in the drawer. I don't remember taking it. I don't remember leaving. Even now, I can't tell you if I ever really did. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some stories aren't meant to end. And somewhere, in the depths of the Ashford Archive, a folder with my name on it waits to be filled.